Welcome everybody
David's got
to
his thing.
Complete Effort, Effortless Effort. This is the third in our series of 3 webinars this year.
So in the first webinar series, we talked about the mystical life or right view, kind of getting the focus, getting the wisdom aspect in line, because view determines everything else.
Everything else.
If your view is clear, everything else tends to follow. So that was in February. And these webinars were around creating a wholesome life around the mystical path, right? So you orientate the view that way. And then in the second webinar series, in June,
we talked about career and creativity, right livelihood. So this is about, our livelihood is about our creative expression. That's about how do we express our life energy on a daily basis. And that is to do with speech and sila and this chakra, self-expression.
And tonight is
that's about integrating our daily life with spiritual awakening, our livelihood with spiritual awakening.
And tonight is the first in the Your Victory's third webinar series on healing the splits within. Healing the splits within, which really implies effort. So it's not just any kind of effort, it's effort that actually works at healing the splits within. And the one place that you're not going to heal the splits within is more talk about me. More me does not heal splits. More me that goes on, the more splits you find.
Could you show the first slide, please, Dave?
Oh, I got it.
Oh, you got it, Sensei.
Right. So this is a picture of Bagan. Oh, it disappeared. Oh, it's back. Oh, it's disappeared. Impermanence.
Yeah.
This is Bagan in Myanmar.
That was a great Dharma trip.
That was a great Dharma trip.
We spent a month in Myanmar. Okay.
Anyway,
we'll be focusing on effort, and that is related to the body and to samadhi, or concentration,
absorption, jhana, energy. So this path is called the path of great healing for a reason, and that's because upon the awakening moment, you kind of get a chiropractic energy body realignment. So with the awakening moment, there comes a whole real organization, a realignment in the body, energetically and chemically, but also physically in terms of the muscle structure and so on. So there's this kind of, it's kind of like it's kind of like Frankenstein, you know, you've been kind of zapped with energy and now you're alive.
Except in a good way.
Except in a good way. So it's like the good Frankenstein, Frank. Goodenstein. So you're straightened out. So it's called the great healing for a reason. It doesn't heal the ego. Please be clear about this. The awakening does not heal or cure the ego. The ego is a tool, and its job is to make decisions, focus one's interest, and what else? Evaluate choices, and follow one's interest. This is what the ego is for. But the ego is not there to make you feel unified or at one with the world. Its job is to separate. So when we talk about complete effort, what we're healing isn't the split in the ego. We're stepping over the ego. We're stepping outside the ego's boundaries to something that doesn't need to have the same agenda that the ego has. That's what heals the ego, a bigger picture, a wider view, a more harmonious relationship with the universe. That's what the effort does. Hallelujah. So the first principle note, I think, has to be repeated a bit. First principles determine outcomes. So, well,
that's like getting the view.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, at first glance, principles may seem abstract. We have to have these in our life, or everything else everything else goes down the road in order if we have these first principles in order. But if we don't have the first principles in order, then things wander off, things get skewed, and life tends to get skewed. Decisions tend to get skewed, and therefore outcomes tend to get skewed. And we end up in marriages that we shouldn't have ended up in, or we end up in jobs or careers we weren't meant to be in, or we end up living in situations that aren't really suiting us because our first principles are off. So we teach this stuff over and over and over again because of the importance of the first principles. If your first principles are in place, everything else follows. Right? So you got to be very careful how you start things. Because if you start things from a mistaken or a false view or a false position, the only possible outcome is a skewed result. Right? Now that's part of our learning curve. Shouldn't feel guilty about it. Shouldn't feel ashamed about it. But what you should do is learn not to do it again. Right? So bringing things back to first principles is really important.
There's also, as our practice deepens and matures, things that we've heard 50 or 100 times resonate with more meaning than they did before. So I think I remember in the early days when I first encountered the Four Ennobling Truths, I was like, oh yeah, sure, life struggle. Yeah, I get it. Oh yeah, okay, there's a really, oh yeah, for Eightfold. And, like check. And of course now I'm like, yeah, God, no shit, life is struggle. Tell me about it, and just the subtlety of that, you just see it again and again, and it resonates more and more deeply.
So the Buddha basically came up with these first principles right at the beginning of his teaching career, which was when he was quite young. And he proceeded to teach it in various ways for the next 40 years. He didn't add a lot of fancy-dancy additions. It was pretty basic, straight down the road, repeating the first principles and doing the practice and keeping the practice and the training that kept those first principles in place. So for 40 years he did this. I've now been teaching 40 years. Doesn't make me a Buddha, but it's kind of a nice association. Anyway, the teaching in different ways is to do the same thing we talked before, which is to eliminate unnecessary suffering. So the unnecessary suffering derives directly from clinging and attachment, hanging on to the impermanent. Trying to make the impermanent permanent is suffering.
Or trying to get rid of what we don't want.
Or trying to get rid of the things that we have no control over, right?
Or trying to figure out which, do I want it or do I not want it?
So these greed, hatred, and delusions put us back in the same box, right? The attachment, the aversion, or the confusion. As you see from the diagram, these are the three traditional symbols for that.
Okay. Greed is a pig, hatred is a snake, and what is confusion?
The cock. The cock.
Oh, that's a rooster. Okay.
So we cling, right? We know that. We cling to breathing, we cling to water, we cling to food, right? We cling to temperature, we cling to protection from the elements. This is necessary suffering. This is what we have to do to survive and live, right? Fair enough. Right? But it's all impermanent. And because it's all impermanent, it's all conjoined with struggle. You can't have something that's impermanent that you're trying to hang on to that removes the struggle. So we return to this idea of unnecessary struggle. That's necessary struggle. You can think of some other things. Food, medicine, warmth. A cell phone and a Lamborghini are not necessary things for survival. They're luxury.
You're talking about necessary suffering? Yeah, it's a fine line, right? Because you take medicine to get over illness, and then maybe you take some medicine to promote wellness, and then pretty soon you've got a cabinet full of a gazillion remedies. And so you can easily tip from necessary to unnecessary.
So food is necessary suffering. Lasagna is unnecessary suffering.
The the sage sauce and the saffron in the lasagna are
Water,
definitely unnecessary.
water is necessary suffering. Perrier is unnecessary suffering, right? A roof over your head is necessary suffering, right? A palace
wallpaper
is
is
unnecessary suffering. So you look at where this line switches, where you move from, we're not saying you shouldn't be comfortable. We're just saying that if your identity or your welfare is tied up in it.
Very important. We're not saying don't do anything.
No,
We're not saying
have a car, fine, but you don't need a car. A car is unnecessary suffering. That doesn't mean you should get rid of it, but you should know that the minute your identity starts to cling to that car, or you have to have this kind of car, then the unnecessary suffering comes in. It's not in the, again, to repeat it over and over again, the suffering is not in the object. It's the needing it, the having to have it, the needing to hang on to it.
So unnecessary suffering or unnecessary struggle also implies unnecessary effort, right? Because we're expending time and energy and probably resources, deciding where to put the carpet or choosing which color car to get or what have you.
So the text often translates suffering as caused by desire. And we've always had a hard time with that expression because life is desire. So there's no life without desire. So suffering isn't caused by desire. Suffering is caused by clinging or attachment to desire, trying to hang on to, trying to keep it, trying to make the impermanent permanent, trying to enshrine or instill or hold a certain place in your being about who you are is an unnecessary form of suffering. You might say, well, I don't have a head for math, unnecessary suffering, right? Or I don't have an artistic sense, unnecessary suffering. You're holding yourself in a place, right? You're holding yourself in an attitude that has nothing to do with you being human. You may not be as good an artist as someone else, but mostly that's probably a certain amount of talent and a certain amount of practice, right? And that's all right. But the unnecessary struggle is the ego's attempt to hang on to something as a form or a way of saying, this is who I am, I'm not that. This is who I am, I'm not that. That is unnecessary suffering. You don't have to say, I am an architect, I am not a piano teacher, even though you are an architect and you don't play the piano, right? But the idea that my identity is defined that way is unnecessary suffering.
So we attribute to the Buddha the discovery or the reinterpretation of the solution for this unnecessary suffering, and that is called the Four Noble Truths. And why do they call? Could you go to slide 4, please, Dave? Why do they call them noble? These, if we understand these truths, it makes for a noble person. So they should really be called the ennobling truths. When we understand them and live them, then we become noble people. So this is the original Pali and quite a literal translation. Can everybody here in the room, can you see those, Dean?
Yeah. So a good part of this is based on preference. It's okay to have preferences, right? I prefer angel food cake to chocolate cake, right? But the degree which I'm happy or unhappy based on that change, that's unnecessary suffering. And that's unnecessary suffering comes up from preferences, making preference mine. So it's not that you shouldn't have preferences, but that the suffering that arises from your preference should be obvious to you, should be apparent to you immediately that this preference has a form of suffering involved in it. Do you need that or do you not need that? So if the preference is removed, your suffering should not increase. If your non-preference is delivered, your suffering should not increase. If you're not mastering that translation, then you're not applying complete or total effort. Complete or total effort is the effort of not getting caught in your preferences. Doesn't mean you can't have them. Just means you can't get caught in them. Right. So the
And we're using here struggle and suffering interchangeably. Those are both translations for dukkha.
right. So when we use the word dukkha, the common translation, right, is struggle, but it
Isn't
can,
it suffering?
suffering, struggle. But dukkha literally means bad formation, like a bad room, bad space, bad space. Dukkha is a trip, bad.
Trip like while you're walking, like
Yeah,
stumbling.
like stumbling. You're on a bad trip. Dukkha. Right. Sukha, the opposite, means good. Su is good. Sukha, good place, bad
Like
place.
sakura.
Sakura, yeah. So, but this dukkha word, it can be translated in many, many different ways. Frustration, irritation, anxiety, boredom, restlessness. Anxiety, I said that already. Worry, worry, irritation, restlessness, depression, grief, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair.
Sloth, torpor.
Indecision is a form of suffering.
Oh, vacillation.
Vacillation. Weak standards, bad performance, inattention to results, the inability to meet honest conflict. This is all suffering. Because where there's two egos, there's two choices. Where there's two choices, there has to be some kind of dialogue or debate. Right? And if you can't enter into the dialogue or you can't enter into the debate, right, without a preference mind involved, you're in unnecessary suffering. And that means if you're in unnecessary suffering, what are you not applying? Review. Complete effort.
Oh, I thought the Four Ennobling Truths.
Well, actually, you're not applying the effort necessary. So the effort's really important as a form. It's under the section on samadhi, concentration, because you have to say, well, okay, I'm paying attention to what's going on here, and this is preference mind, and I don't need to be in suffering over preference mind. I'm applying the effort of recognizing it such and letting go of the clinging or attachment or aversion that's arising because of that. That's complete effort.
So where do we learn about right effort? At that last photo. That's where.
So the idea of having a community or having a group of people makes it, gives you a training ground, gives you a training place. So whether it's virtual as online, or whether it's
like now,
actual, where we're sitting, or where maybe you're sitting.
Or in your local sanghas.
Right, or even in your home. It's where you practice. Is that what you wanted to do?
Okay. So we also practice these. We practice these in our work and in our relationships, in our daily lives, and these can become habits. How we behave can become habits.
Habits are largely unconscious. You think you're aware, but you're not. You kind of do it by memory, right? And my classic example is the sleepwalker who can make breakfast and not know he's done it. And he can do a perfectly good job. He's doing it all from unconscious memory patterns. So a good part of our habits are unconscious and predictable. So we're going to ask you to track your habits this week.
Some physical habits, some emotional
habits, and some mental habits. You know it's a habit when you just do it without thinking about it.
So maybe there obviously are small habits and big habits, right? It could be something like I scratch my mosquito bites as a habit. Or it could be something like I always interrupt my partner when they're talking, for example. Or another habit could be I have a strong inner critic. That would be maybe under emotional.
Or mental.
Would that be emotional or mental?
Depends on your feeling about it. If you had a negative feeling about it, it would be emotional. If it was kind of more of a theoretical, it'd be more mental. If you do happen to have some friends around, some Sangha, you can ask them to kind of point out a habit you might
That's
have.
always fun.
That's always fun, right? A habit
Boy,
that
there's
you
some real
have over-
surprises with what
Yeah,
people
there's
tell
some-
you. The people who, and really wonderful surprises, you know, the people who you're scared to ask because you think they're going to say something kind of mean, actually say something really lovely.
Sometimes your best friends say the meanest things because they've been waiting 20 years to say it. But remember, seeing it as mean is unnecessary suffering.
That's right.
Seeing it as liberative is necessary suffering. Okay?